Chapter 1, The Ghost Carriage. Metal screamed as if the world itself were tearing apart. The locomotive swallowed the night in one long breath and spat it back out in clouds of steam. On the platform at Dijon, the air smelled of coal, machine oil, and a rain that never quite began. People hurried into the carriages, collars raised, each carrying their own story, their own fatigue. He walked slowly. The kind of slow that belongs to a man who knows there's no need to rush anymore. 30 steps across the gravel. 2 words to the conductor. A ticket. A nod. Louis Le Prince climbed into a second-class compartment, clutching a heavy leather suitcase with bronze fittings. Inside it, gears, lenses, sheets of sketches, and something more, the future, though no one yet knew it. The door slammed shut, the train lurched forward, and the iron began to sing low, like the bones of an ancient beast. The air in the compartment smelled of lacquer, old leather, and whiskey. Le Prince removed his hat, placed the suitcase on his knees, and listened to the steady rhythm of the wheels. In his notebook, on dark blue paper, fine lines of handwriting traced exposure times, notes on light sensitivity, calculations of motion. He was calm. Too calm. Everything was ready, the demonstration in Paris, then New York, patents, investors. All that was left was to arrive. Footsteps passed in the corridor, even, unhurried. He looked up. A shadow slid across the glass door, yet the reflection moved just a moment earlier than the shape itself. He blinked. A trick of the light, perhaps. The train gathered speed. Villages flickered by, black trees, distant lights melting into the damp air like candles in a dungeon. He leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes. Before him came the vision again, brief moving images filmed months earlier. His wife Lizzie in sunlight, his son running toward the camera. The first motion picture ever made. He smiled. Time, trapped inside a box. The watch read 12:45. He looked at the hands, and in that instant the rhythm of the wheels faltered. The sound died. Silence thickened around him, dense and heavy, like sinking into black water. He rose. Opened the door. The corridor was empty. Not simply deserted, dead. The air dry and still, like a room that hasn't been breathed in for years. On the floor lay his suitcase. Open. Empty. Le Prince took a step. His gaze caught the window. In the reflection, he saw himself, still seated where he had been moments ago. Calm face. Motionless hands. Eyes staring sideways. He turned. The seat was empty. Paris greeted the train with a gray dawn. Steam wrapped the platform, coiling around wheels and boots. Passengers stepped out, yawning, collecting their luggage. The conductor walked the corridor, checking compartments. One door was locked. He knocked. No answer. Again. The lock clicked. Inside, nothing. No passenger. No baggage. Not even the faint crease of a body that had once sat there. On the fogged-up window, a single phrase traced by a fingertip. Le temps s'enfuit. Time runs away. The newspapers would call it the mystery of the century. Police reports would note dryly, passenger Louis Le Prince, engineer, age 48, disappeared between Dijon and Paris. No witnesses. No trace. Only an empty compartment, and a sentence that felt like the signature at the end of an era. Because that night, cinema was born, out of disappearance. Chapter 2, The Men Who Created Cinema. Long before the world learned to watch itself, there lived a man who tried to make time move. His name was Louis Augustin Le Prince. Too meticulous to be an adventurer, too obsessed to be merely a scientist. Tall, thin, with nervous fingers smelling of oil and photographic chemicals. In his pockets, screws, lenses, fragments of ideas that clinked softly as he walked. France in the late 19th century was busy with other things: politics, war, wine, dresses. No one looked his way. He was one of those quiet men who are invisible until they vanish. Born in Metz, educated by artists, befriended by chemists, and married to an Englishwoman, Elizabeth Whitley, a woman with clear eyes and endless patience. She was his mirror, his anchor. While he tinkered with brass cylinders and glass lenses, she translated his chaos into language the world might understand. In England, they opened a workshop. Outside, the sign read Photographic View Company. Inside, silence, ether, the rustle of paper. There, Leprince first united magnesium flash with a rotating drum, lenses with film. At first, nothing worked. Images tore apart, shutters jammed, the world refused to move. And then, one day, everything aligned. In the garden outside their home, on a sunny afternoon, he set up a wooden tripod, loaded the camera, and turned the handle. His wife, his son, and their friends walked past, laughing, unaware that they were stepping into eternity. Seconds later, the first moving image in history. The Roundhay garden scene. When the film was developed, Leprince said nothing. On the glass plate, people came to life, people who, moments ago, were gone. He realized he was no longer a painter or an engineer. He had become something else entirely, a clockmaker for eternity. But eternity doesn't like to be touched. He tried to patent his invention. The wording was dry, a device for the sequential capture of images to produce motion. In truth, a machine to trap life itself. He showed it to friends, scientists, merchants. Some laughed, a toy. Others frowned, too strange, too ahead of its time. From Paris came rejection. From London, silence. So he decided to go to America. Across the ocean, people were not afraid of the new. There, money smelled like possibility. Elizabeth begged him to wait. But he was certain only a demonstration would change everything. He would show the first films, the Roundhay garden scene, Leeds Bridge crossing. He believed those few frames contained his immortality. In those days, he began to say strange things. About time that leaves traces. About eyes that could look into the past. About a future where people would argue over what was real. Sometimes Elizabeth caught his gaze and felt that he was already gone. Living somewhere ahead of the rest of the world. The night before his trip, he stayed with his brother Albert in Dijon. They shared dinner, talked of patents, Paris, the future. Albert laughed. "You'll soon make the dead dance, Louis." "Perhaps," Leprince replied, "but I want the living to keep breathing." He slept little. Dreamed of endless reels of film, his life, just a fragment between two flashes of light. At dawn, he shaved, drank coffee, embraced his brother, and boarded the train to Paris. In his suitcase, camera, blueprints, letters, and documents. In his mind, silence, and the certainty that he was stepping into immortality. He didn't know that immortality often begins with disappearance. Chapter 3. The Great Secret on Wheels. Paris was waiting for him. Literally, waiting. Letters, replies, invitations, everything was ready. All that remained was to arrive. But between yesterday and tomorrow there is a narrow gap where time loses its memory. And it was there that the train carrying Louis Leprince entered. The morning was cool but clear. He stood on the platform of Dijon station, clutching his suitcase to his side. Beside him, his brother Albert waved and smiled, the reserved smile of those accustomed to farewells. The train whistled, steam rising into the gray sky. Leprince responded with a brief nod, climbed the steps, and disappeared into the carriage. A moment later, the train pulled out. The wheels crunched over their joints, and the wind ruffled his hair through the half-open window. He watched the platform drift away, like a film slowly rewinding. It suddenly seemed as if he'd seen it all before, the same station, the same gestures, his brother's same smile. As if someone had pressed replay. The carriage was quiet. Several passengers dozed in the far compartment, one was reading a newspaper that smelled of fresh printer's ink. Leprince sank back into his seat and placed his suitcase at his feet. He pulled out a notebook, it contained his latest calculations, belt flow charts, and patent amendments. The notes were clear, like the imprints of fate. He reread them until the train picked up speed. Outside, fields, gray houses, and flocks of birds flashed by like ink marks in the sky. Then it began to rain. Petty, tedious, as if the world were trying to erase the road he was traveling on. Towards evening, he felt tired. Sleep fell upon him unexpectedly. He placed his hand on his suitcase and fell asleep. When he woke, it was dark. The silence was thick, as if the train had been wrapped in cotton wool. It took him a moment to realize the train was no longer making noise. The wheels didn't rumble, the metal didn't creak. Only a slight tremor, like breath beneath his skin. He stepped out into the corridor. No one. No conductor, no passengers. Not even the sound of wind. The compartment doors stood open, the windows darkened. He walked along the aisle, feeling the cold seep through his clothes. He felt as if someone was following him. Step, pause. Step, pause. He turned abruptly. Empty. He returned to the compartment, the suitcase was gone. The floor glistened with moisture, as if someone had recently spilled water or tears. He ran his hand across the window, his palm left a mark, and behind the glass, there was nothing. No rails, no landscape. Just endless blackness. He stepped back. Suddenly the carriage jerked, sharply, as if something outside was pulling him back. His ears popped, his temples rang. He screamed, but no sound came out. The world around him shuddered and folded, like old film rolled into a tube. When the train arrived in Paris, everything looked normal. The passengers disembarked, the conductor took off his cap, the locomotive hummed, and workers cleaned the wheels. Only one compartment remained closed. It opened with difficulty, the lock seemed to resist. Inside, there was no one, no belongings. On the floor, a streak of dust, perfectly smooth, like the spot where the suitcase had stood. On the wall, a palm print. And nothing else. The police took statements. The conductor swore he'd checked everyone's tickets. No one saw Le Prince get off. Not at a single station. Not on a single stretch of the train. Theories scattered like ashes. Suicide. Accident. Kidnapping. But who kidnaps an engineer with no fortune? And how can someone fall off a train without leaving a trace? The newspapers vied with each other about the French inventor who vanished from the face of the earth. There were no witnesses. No evidence. Only the legend remained. Albert, the brother, arrived in Paris 2 days later. He boarded that very same carriage, sat in that very same seat. He stared for a long time at the glass with his brother's handprint imprinted on it. Then he said quietly, almost in a whisper. He always wanted to capture time. It seems time has captured him now. Thus began an investigation that never really happened. No one wanted to look. The police were tired of miracles, the newspapers were waiting for more. And in Le Prince's laboratory in Leeds, under a layer of dust, lay a wooden box containing lenses and a drum. It was silent. But if you listened closely, a soft knocking sound was still going on inside it. As if someone was still filming. Chapter 4. The investigation that never happened. Paris was accustomed to mysterious disappearances. Every year, Senna removed bodies, the police lost cases, and newspapers found sensational stories. But this case stood out from the usual statistics. An engineer, an inventor, travels to the capital with a project, and vanishes. Without witnesses, without noise, without a trace. As if cut from reality, precisely, with a razor blade. The first days after the disappearance still seemed real. Telegrams, interrogations, meetings. Brother Albert traveled between Dijon and Paris, checking every inch of the route. The police reports, polite formulations, blank lines, cautious expressions. Possible suicide. Possible amnesia. Possible intervention by third parties. When all options are equally impossible, reports become art. Elizabeth wrote letters. Politely, insistently, as if asking not for help but for someone to remember. She contacted the prefecture, the British embassy, the newspapers. No one answered. The ink faded faster than the replies arrived. A week later, the first mention appeared in the newspapers. Mysterious disappearance of a French engineer. Investigation continues. 2 weeks later, a second. Probably an accident. The body has not yet been found. And a month later, silence. As if the man named Louis Le Prince had never existed. The police were indeed doing something. First, they questioned the conductors. They swore that there had been a passenger in compartment number 5, he had boarded in Dijon and was traveling alone. In Paris, the door was locked from the inside. This confused everyone. One of the gendarmes noted in his report, "No sign of an exit or entrance. Perhaps he disappeared en route." Inexplicably. The phrase seemed absurd even on paper. Whispers began in Dijon. Some claimed to have seen Le Prince at the station after the train had departed. Others said that a carriage carrying two men and boxes similar to his suitcase had passed by that day. And in a tavern on the outskirts, an old cab driver said that a man wearing Le Prince's hat had approached him and offered to pay for a night's lodging, but had disappeared before dawn. Rumors are the perfect form of truth, which no one believes. In November, a man's body was found on the banks of the Seine. The newspapers reported, a drowned man with a mustache and beard, about 40 years old. Albert arrived at the morgue. The body was already unrecognizable, but the height and skull were consistent. He stared at the dead man for a long time. Then he said quietly, "No. It wasn't him." He himself didn't know if he was lying. Time did what it does best, erase traces. In December, the police closed the case. The report contained the line, "Disappeared without apparent cause. Presumed dead." That was the end of it. Elizabeth refused to resign herself to it. She collected all the drawings, letters, and sketches left in the workshop. Each one bore his neat handwriting, dry and precise, like a surgeon's lines. She began writing a book, The True History of the Invention of Moving Pictures. But the publishers refused. No one wanted to get involved with the widow of a man who didn't exist. In London, they forgot about him. In France, they pretended they didn't know. And in America, rumor had it, an inventor named Thomas Edison was already working on a device with remarkably similar principles. Albert kept his brother's suitcase. Empty. No papers, no blueprints, nothing. Sometimes he opened it and simply looked inside. Deep inside the suitcase was a mark from a blow, as if someone had tried to escape from inside. The investigation was over. The story, no. Sometimes Elizabeth would wake at night to a sound, as if a mechanism were clicking behind the wall, slowly, evenly. She would get up, light the lamp, and walk through the house. Silence. Only her own reflection in the window. She stared at it for a long time, until she noticed, the reflection was breathing slightly faster than she was. And so began the great oblivion. The world moved on, like a train from which someone had fallen, unaware of the loss. And in the police archives, between yellowed pages, remained one short note in pencil in the margins. Maybe it wasn't he who disappeared. Maybe time itself disappeared. Chapter 5. Edison enters the stage. America has always loved the spectacle. There, it doesn't matter who invented it, it matters who demonstrated it first. And who said louder, "This is mine." While dust was settling on old protocols in France, another man overseas was preparing a premiere. His name was Thomas Alva Edison. He was neither an artist nor a dreamer. He was a merchant of time. Every minute cost him money, every idea a contract. Edison understood a simple thing. An invention isn't something that's conceived, but something that's formalized. With a seal. With a signature. With a lawyer by his side. Around 1894, he unveiled a new curiosity to the public, the kinetoscope. A wooden box with an eyepiece, inside which images moved. People crowded into the laboratory, stood on tiptoe, peered through the opening, and gasped. There, behind the glass, a man waved his hat, a woman twirled, a horse walked. Everything moved. Everything was alive. The newspapers wrote, "Mr. Edison, the father of cinematography." And at that moment, history finally decided who owned the future. In England, Elizabeth Le Prince read these lines over her morning tea. Her fingers trembled, the newspaper smelled of dust and betrayal. She reread the article over and over until the letters blurred. Then she carefully placed the newspaper on the table, stood up, and went to the workshop. Lewis's old drawing hung on the wall. Everything, the same cylinders, gears, tape. Only the captions were in English. She took a pair of scissors and cut off the bottom edge where the date was. 1888. 6 years before Edison's invention. She wrote letters to the patent office, to scientific societies, to newspapers. The responses were the same, polite, cold, like letters from a notary at a funeral. There is insufficient evidence. Your husband's disappearance makes the case impossible. Without the original documents, the matter cannot be heard. And yet the documents had disappeared along with him. Sometimes she dreamed of Louis returning, wearing a coat, carrying a suitcase, with that same tired smile. He entered, placed the suitcase on the table, opened it. And inside, emptiness. And only a reflection in the shiny lid, an alien face, broad, confident, with an American mustache. Edison, however, moved on. He created an entire industry. Films, gadgets, studios. He basked in fame and the spotlight. Dozens of clocks ticked in his workshop, everyone counted out their profits. When a journalist asked him if he feared competition, Edison chuckled. Competition? That's when someone gets there first. I didn't see anyone ahead. The phrase spread like an aphorism throughout the newspapers. Fate can play tricks, especially on those who were truly ahead. In Leeds, Le Prince's son, Adolphe, now an adult, tried to prove the truth. He carried photographs, letters, and excerpts from his father's notebooks. They ridiculed him. Young man, your father had a wonderful imagination. Time has put everything in its place. He replied quietly. Time has a way of putting crosses in the air, without discerning who is to blame. He tried to sue. But there is no place in the courts for those who have disappeared. There, only documents live, and all he had were shadows. In 1901, Edison finally won the motion picture rights case in New York. The judges stood up, and the verdict was solemn. He shook the lawyer's hand and said, "All is fair." That same evening, Elizabeth received a letter. Your lawsuit is dismissed. The rights to the invention of the moving image belong to Thomas Edison. She smiled. Not from pain, but from exhaustion. She placed the letter on the table, next to the last photo of Louis. In the photo, he stood against a garden backdrop, slightly turned toward the camera. As if he wanted to leave but changed his mind. That evening, she lit the lamp, stared into the flickering light for a long time, and said quietly, "He did show the world cinema after all. Just from the wrong train car." And on the other side of the ocean, in a luxurious office, Thomas Edison was signing another contract. A pocket watch stood on the table, ticking away at a steady rhythm. If he had listened more closely, he might have thought that another sound was interwoven beneath the ticking, a quiet, barely audible one. Like the rustle of film reel. That someone else had once started. And since then, the world lived in an illusion. Le Prince's name disappeared from the newspapers. And Edison became known as the father of cinema. History chose the one who came last, but said loudest that he was first. Chapter 6. Black frame. There's a frame no one sees. It lasts a split second, between the last click and the first light. All who have disappeared live there. In 1909, 20 years after Le Prince's disappearance, an old mechanic in Leeds stumbled upon a dusty box. Inside was a metal camera, rusted but surprisingly complex. He took it to the local university, where a professor of the history of technology turned it over in his hands for a long moment and said, "Nothing special. Just a routine optical experiment." And he placed it on the shelf. And so, oblivion lasted for another decade. By this time, cinema had already become a new religion. In Paris, the Lumière brothers' salons; in New York, the Edison halls; in Berlin, entire film studios. The world was learning to look. Learning to trust images more than eyes. And that's exactly what Louis wanted. He dreamed of the picture coming to life. He just didn't know that when a picture comes to life, someone else must die. They say a strange sound could be heard in Elizabeth's house in the evenings. Not loud, like someone turning an old reel. The neighbors thought it was a clock. But she didn't have a clock. She lived out her days quietly, without complaints, without hysterics. Only occasionally would she take out an old photograph, the one with Louis standing against the backdrop of the garden. And she would stare at it for so long that it seemed the picture would move at any moment. She would whisper, "If cinema brings the dead back to life, maybe you managed to see the rest of your shot there." The story of Edison was becoming increasingly loud at this time. The genius of electricity, the creator of light, the men who gave the world movement. Newspapers printed portraits, biographies, and anniversary articles. Not a word about Le Prince. Even in academic works, his name disappeared, as if someone had cut out an entire page. The irony is that Edison himself disliked watching films. He said, "Real life is more interesting than any shadows." Perhaps he was simply afraid to see among the shadows the one he had displaced. In the 1900s and 19th century, approximately the 1930s, film of Le Prince's first experiments was accidentally found in an old archive. A short fragment, a garden in Leeds, a woman walking along a path, a man in a top hat turning, a boy running past. Just 2 seconds. But these 2 seconds are older than all other films. And on these 2 seconds lies the foundation of all cinema. Only his name never appeared in the credits. There's an old legend. Supposedly, an unaccounted negative is stored in one of the Paris archives. It shows a man in a long coat boarding a train. He turns his head, looks directly into the lens, and smiles. The train starts moving, the camera shakes, the image blurs. And in the last frame, there's an empty space where he was just standing. But no one has ever found the negative itself. Perhaps it's just a beautiful lie. Although who said a lie is worse than the truth, if it's more honest? In the world of cinema, there's a term, black frame. It's the moment before the film begins. Without it, nothing can be seen. It's like a breath before a word. Silence before a confession. Perhaps Louis Le Prince was that black frame. The one who opened the way, but remained in the darkness. Without him, there would be no light. Sometimes at night, if you stare at a blank screen for long enough, you might notice something moving. A silhouette, the outline of a face. A moment in which a man, ahead of time, is trapped. Louis Le Prince disappeared. But he was the first to capture movement. And then, he became part of it. And perhaps, since then, every film begins with his breath. With that same sigh the camera takes before reviving the dead. Sometimes the truth disappears along with those who knew it. But sometimes it simply waits, in a black frame, for someone to press play. Chapter 7. The Shadow of Light. When the world learned to see movement, it forgot how to see people. Light displaced shadows, and no one noticed that it was from them that this light was born. Decades passed. The name Louis Le Prince was remembered less and less, and then completely. Even his descendants were unsure whether he had existed as they remembered him. History has a way of polishing the truth until it begins to shine like a coin. And a coin always belongs to the one who holds it in his hand. In the mid-20th century, a professor at the Sorbonne, while researching early forms of cinema, came across a reference to a French engineer who had disappeared under strange circumstances. Intrigued, he began digging. A year later, he died of a heart attack, right at his desk. The newspaper wrote. The scientist died while working on the history of cinema. Le Prince's name wasn't even mentioned there. Every few years, someone remembers him again. Documentaries are made, articles are written. But it all comes back to the same thing. No body, no evidence, no hero. History loves order. And the disappeared don't fit into it. Sometimes it seems Louis Le Prince has become not just a man, but a symbol. An invisible man whose name has dissolved into the frames he himself taught to move. He disappeared, but he left behind a principle. The world can be captured. Even if it means disappearing yourself. This is the tragedy of the inventor. Creating a way to preserve life, he is the first to lose it. Creating light, he becomes a shadow. History repeats itself over and over again, only the actors change. If you go into a small museum in Leeds, on the second floor, in a glass case, there is a strange apparatus. Dark wood, brass fittings, a crack running along the frame. Beneath it is a plaque. Le Prince camera. Circa 1888. One of the first cameras for filming moving images. People approach, take photographs, and move on. Almost no one reads the caption. They are more interested in looking at the glowing screens in the next room. But if you linger for a second, you might notice a face reflected in the polished metal. Vague, blurred, as if through old film. And it seems to be smiling. With a slight weariness. Like a man who has finally realized. that his film is still going on. Elizabeth died long before her son, too. All that remains of the Le Princes are images. A garden, the sun, figures walking along a path. No drama, no tragedy. Just life, captured 2 seconds before everyone else. Today, cinema is a dream factory, a billion-dollar industry, an endless stream of light. But every time the lights go out, for a moment everything returns to the beginning. To the moment when darkness becomes a canvas. And the first ray makes history out of it. And perhaps it is precisely at this very moment. In the silence before the shot. In the pause between the breath and the flash. Somewhere nearby, a man in a coat passes. Boards his train. And disappears again. Because cinema began not with the one who showed. But with the one who disappeared. And perhaps this is the true price of invention. To surrender oneself to the light. So that the world can learn to see.